My kids locked me out of their house on Thanksgiving night. I stood outside with gifts in my hands, shivering in the cold, while the family I raised turned off the lights and pretended I didn't exist. If you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now let me take you back to the beginning of that night. It was supposed to be one of the happiest days of the year, a day where families come together, share food, laughter, and love. I'd been planning this visit for weeks, even though my body isn't what it used to be. The trip wasn't easy, long hours on buses and trains, carrying my old suitcase in one hand and a bag filled with pies and small gifts in the other. But I didn't mind. In fact, I felt like a young man again, filled with excitement at the thought of seeing my children, my grandson, and being a part of their Thanksgiving celebration. I imagined the moment over and over during the trip. The door would open, my grandson would come running, and my daughter would hug me tight. My son would pat me on the back and say, "Dad, you made it. We've been waiting for you." I could almost hear the sound of laughter echoing in the house, smell the roasted turkey, and feel the warmth of belonging that I missed so deeply. Every mile that passed, I grew more eager. I thought about my late wife, how much she loved Thanksgiving, how she always insisted on making everything perfect. For years after she passed, I still celebrated alone, quietly, with just her memory by my side. But this year was supposed to be different. This year, I wanted to surprise them. I wanted to walk in and see their joy. I wanted to feel like a father again, like I still mattered. I had no idea that when I finally reached that doorstep, my excitement would turn into the deepest humiliation of my life. When I think back to the Thanksgivings of my younger years, I can still see the kitchen filled with warmth, my wife bustling around with her apron on, and the children running from room to room, their laughter echoing through the house. Back then, I never imagined a day would come when I'd be standing outside their home, unwanted, like a stranger. Those were the days when family meant everything, when my children still looked up at me with shining eyes, believing their father could do no wrong. I remember carving the turkey while my son sat proudly by my side, waiting for me to give him the first slice. My daughter would giggle as she snuck pieces of pie crust from the counter, and my wife would scold her playfully, pretending to be mad while smiling the whole time. The house always smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh bread. It wasn't just food on the table, it was love, sacrifice, and the bond of a family that stood together through thick and thin. Even after my wife passed, I tried to keep the tradition alive. I would invite them home, cook as best as I could, and set the table for us. But slowly, they began to visit less. At first, they came with excuses. Too much work, too far to drive, the kids had other plans. I told myself it was normal, that children grow up and build lives of their own. But each year, their absence cut deeper. The calls grew shorter, the visits fewer, until eventually, the only Thanksgiving companion I had was the memory of a time long gone. Still, I never stopped loving them. I never stopped believing that one day they would remember where they came from and who had given them everything they had. That belief is what carried me on the long journey to their home that night. I thought maybe, just maybe, walking into their warm kitchen again would bring back the spirit of family. I thought my surprise would spark joy, and for a moment it almost felt real in my mind. But as I would soon learn, sometimes the memories you hold dearest mean nothing to those who've already let go of you. It didn't happen all at once. The change was slow, almost invisible at first, like a crack in a wall that you don't notice until one day it split wide open. I used to believe my children respected me, that even if they didn't visit often, deep down they carried the lessons I taught them. But over the years, small things began to reveal the truth. It started with the calls. They used to call me just to ask how I was doing, to tell me about their day, to share a little moment of their lives. Then the calls grew shorter. They turned into quick updates about bills, about schedules, about things that didn't leave room for love. And eventually, the calls stopped unless I was the one reaching out. Even then, they often let the phone ring or answered with voices that carried more impatience than warmth. Then came the visits. When they were younger, my kids couldn't wait to come home, to sit in their old rooms, to eat my cooking. But later, whenever I invited them, they always had excuses. Working late, the children had sports, the weather wasn't good. I'd cook meals that never got eaten, set the table for guests who never arrived, and sit there staring at the empty chairs, trying to convince myself that next year would be different. I also began to notice how they looked at the gifts I gave. I never had much, but I always gave from the heart, hand-knit scarves, small trinkets, books I thought they'd enjoy. But instead of gratitude, there were smirks, side glances, polite thank yous that felt forced. My daughter-in-law in particular seemed to take pride in mocking my efforts, calling my gifts cheap when she thought I couldn't hear. My son would laugh nervously at her words instead of defending me. Each small slight chipped away at me, though I tried to ignore it. I told myself that love was enough, that respect would return with time. But deep down, I began to feel the sting of rejection long before that night at their door. I didn't realize it then, but all those subtle signs, the missed calls, the empty chairs, the mocking smiles, were warnings. Warnings of a betrayal far colder than I could have ever imagined. After so many years of excuses and silence, I could have given up. I could have stayed home again, sitting at my little kitchen table with nothing but a single plate and fading memories. But something inside me refused to accept that as my future. I told myself that family couldn't just disappear, that maybe all it would take was one gesture to remind them of the bond we once had. That was when I made the decision to surprise them for Thanksgiving. I didn't tell them I was coming. I wanted it to be a moment they'd never forget. I imagined knocking on their door and seeing their shocked faces melt into joy. I pictured my son wrapping me in a hug and saying, "Dad, you came all this way for us." I thought about my daughter rushing to bring me inside, seating me at the table, making me feel like I belonged again. Even my grandson, I dreamed he would climb into my lap, the way he used to when he was small, asking me to tell him one of my old stories. I spent days planning. I packed my old suitcase carefully, choosing small gifts I knew they'd once loved. I baked pies the way my wife used to, hoping the familiar smell would stir their memories of when we were together as a true family. Every detail mattered to me because I wanted them to feel my love, to know I hadn't given up on them, even if they had drifted away from me. The night before I left, I sat in my living room and looked around at the empty walls, thinking of all the holidays that had passed in silence. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement. I told myself this would be the turning point, the moment where everything changed for the better. I truly believed that once I was standing at their door, with pies in my hands and love in my heart, the distance between us would vanish. But what I didn't know was that the journey I was about to take wouldn't end in warmth and laughter. It would end with the cruelest lesson of my life, waiting for me behind a locked door. The morning of Thanksgiving, I woke before the sun. My old alarm clock rattled on the nightstand, though I barely needed it. I hadn't slept much the night before. My heart was too full of hope, too restless with anticipation. I packed the last of my things, double-checked the pies, and carefully tucked the little gifts inside my suitcase. Then, with a deep breath, I locked my front door and stepped out into the crisp November air, determined to make the long journey to my children. The trip was not easy for me anymore. My legs aren't as strong as they once were, and the cold cuts deep into my bones. Still, I carried my bags with a sense of purpose, reminding myself that every step brought me closer to family. The bus station was crowded with travelers going home for the holiday, families laughing together, children running up to their grandparents with arms outstretched. I sat quietly among them, holding on to my suitcase and imagining how it would feel when my own grandson did the same for me. Hours stretched on as I switched buses and waited in drafty terminals. I bought a cup of weak coffee from a vending machine and sipped it slowly, thinking about the years I had missed with them. I told myself that it didn't matter anymore. None of the past arguments or neglect mattered, because today I was going to show up. Today they would see me and remember that I was still their father. On the final leg of the journey, I stared out the window at the endless lines of trees, their bare branches scratching at the gray sky. The roads were slick with frost, and the world outside looked harsh and lonely. Yet inside my chest burned a quiet warmth, the thought of sitting at a table with people I loved. When the bus finally reached their town, my heart leapt. I stepped out with stiff legs, pulling my old coat tighter around me, and started walking toward the neighborhood I knew so well. Each block brought back memories of when I had helped them move into that house, of the weekends I had visited when my wife was still alive, of laughter spilling out from the yard. The closer I got, the stronger my hope grew. I believed I was walking toward a reunion. Instead, I was heading straight into heartbreak. As I turned the final corner into their neighborhood, the air seemed sharper, colder, as though the world itself was preparing me for what I was about to face. The houses on the block were glowing with warm lights and festive decorations. Pumpkins still sat proudly on porches, and wreaths hung on front doors, reminders of the season's joy. The smell of roasted turkey and spiced pies drifted faintly through the air, wrapping around me like an invitation to something I desperately longed to be part of. Families could be seen through windows, gathering around tables, laughing together. For a moment, I felt a pang of envy, because soon, I thought, I would have that too. When their house came into view, my heart skipped. I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, clutching the handles of my bags, and simply looked. The sight stirred something deep inside me. This wasn't just any house. It was the home I had once worked so hard to give them. I remembered standing there years ago, helping them paint the walls, fixing the broken steps, mowing the lawn when they were too busy. Every brick seemed to carry a memory of sacrifice and love. I noticed the curtains drawn in the living room, but through the thin fabric I could see the faint glow of lights. Shadows moved inside, and I thought I heard laughter. My chest swelled with anticipation. They were there. They were celebrating, and in just a moment, I would be part of it. I set my suitcase down at the edge of the porch and adjusted my coat. My hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from excitement. I imagined my grandson's little face lighting up when he saw me. Imagined my daughter rushing over to pull me inside. Imagined the warmth of family wrapping itself around me again after so many lonely years. I climbed the steps slowly, savoring every second, because I wanted to remember this feeling of hope. I didn't know it would be the last time I felt it that night. Standing before the door, pies carefully balanced in my hand, I lifted my fist and knocked. The sound echoed through the hallway inside, and I waited with my heart pounding. I had no idea that behind that door, the people I loved most in this world were already deciding to shut me out forever. Standing there on the porch, I could feel the weight of every year I had lived pressing down on me. The pies in my hands suddenly felt heavier, my suitcase at my side like a stone chained to me. Yet in that moment, all I felt was anticipation. My breath fogged in the cold night air, and each exhale seemed to whisper a prayer. Let them be happy to see me. Let this be the night that brings us back together. The porch light glowed faintly above me, throwing shadows across the wooden boards beneath my feet, and I stared at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for the warmth I had been missing for so long. I could hear faint movement inside, footsteps, the scrape of a chair, the rise and fall of voices. My heart leapt, certain they were hurrying to the door. I pictured my son's face appearing first, surprise breaking into joy as he called for the others. I imagined my grandson racing through the hallway, shouting, "Grandpa's here!" The image filled my chest so fully I almost smiled right there on the porch, as though the reunion had already begun. But a small voice at the back of my mind whispered doubts. What if they weren't happy to see me? What if my visit was an inconvenience, something they'd rather avoid? I shook the thought away. No, this was Thanksgiving. Family meant everything on this day. Surely they would welcome me in, even if only out of tradition, out of love, or out of the memory of all the years we had once shared together. I shifted from one foot to the other, feeling the bite of the cold seeping into my bones. But I told myself it wouldn't be long. I thought about what I would say first when the door opened. Should I apologize for surprising them? Or should I simply say, "Happy Thanksgiving, I missed you"? I rehearsed the words silently, wanting everything to be perfect, wanting them to know this wasn't just a visit. It was me reaching out, one last time, to hold the family together. My knuckles still tingled from knocking, but no one had answered yet. I leaned closer to the door, listening, hoping for footsteps. What I didn't realize was that the silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was decision, a cruel one, and it would cut deeper than any words ever could. The sound of my knock echoed through the hallway inside their home, sharp and clear, a signal that I was finally here. I straightened my back, wiped my free hand on my coat, and waited. For a moment there was silence. Then I heard the muffled shuffle of feet against the hardwood floor, and my heart lifted. They had heard me. Any second now the door would swing open, and the warmth I had been craving would wrap itself around me like a blanket. But instead of joy or hurried footsteps toward me, what I heard froze me in place. A voice, my daughter's voice, whispering urgently, just loud enough for me to catch the words. "Don't open it. If he comes in, he'll ruin everything." At first, I thought I must have misheard. I leaned closer, straining to catch the sound. Then another voice, sharper, impatient, hissed, "Just leave it. Pretend we're not home. He'll go away." My heart sank. My legs weakened, and I had to grip the pie tin tighter to stop it from slipping. I waited, telling myself it was some kind of joke, some misunderstanding. Maybe they were teasing, maybe they were planning a surprise of their own. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became that this was no joke. The voices hushed, and I heard the faint click of a light switch. Through the curtains, I saw the glow in the living room disappear, swallowed by darkness. The sting of the cold suddenly grew sharper, cutting through my coat, pressing into my bones. I stood there, staring at the door that I once thought would always be open to me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own family's home. My chest tightened, and my throat burned as though the air itself was trying to choke me. I wanted to knock again, to shout, to beg them to let me in, but some part of me, the part that had endured years of excuses and silences, already knew the truth. They weren't going to open that door. They had made their choice. And as I stood there in the dark, pies trembling in my hands, I realized that choice would change everything between us forever. I stood frozen on that porch, my ears straining for any sound that might prove me wrong, any sign that the voices I'd just heard had been nothing more than my imagination. But then, clear as ice, I caught another whisper. This time it was my son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders, the boy I once taught to ride a bike. His voice cut through the door, low but steady. If we let him in, he'll never leave. He'll sit there, dragging the night down with his stories. He'll ruin everything. The words struck me harder than any blow ever could. I tightened my grip on the pie tin, my knuckles white from the effort of not letting it drop. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. This was my son, the one I had sacrificed for, worked myself to the bone for, given every piece of my youth to raise, and here he was, speaking of me like I was nothing more than a burden. Then came the cruelest cut of all. My daughter-in-law's laughter, sharp and dismissive, like the snap of a whip. Exactly. He'll just sit there and complain. Let him freeze a little. Maybe he'll stop showing up uninvited. Her voice was dripping with mockery, with disdain so thick I could almost feel it pouring through the wood of the door. I felt the blood rush to my face, the sting of humiliation spreading through every part of me. I wanted to shout, to remind them who I was, what I had done for them, the countless nights I had gone without so they could have more. But the words caught in my throat. All I could do was stand. There, listening as my family, the people I loved more than my own life, dismissed me as if I were nothing. I looked at the window one last time. The faint shadows inside shifted, but no one came to the door. I could almost picture them sitting back down at the table, eating, laughing, pretending I had never knocked at all. My chest ached with a loneliness I hadn't known was possible, and the pies in my hands felt like a cruel reminder of how foolish I had been to hope. In that moment, something inside me cracked. The bond I thought could never be broken had been shattered with whispers and laughter behind a locked door. The last light inside flickered and then disappeared, leaving the house cloaked in darkness. For a moment, I thought maybe they had gone to bed early. Maybe it was all just terrible timing. But deep down, I knew better. They had turned off the lights not out of sleepiness, but out of choice. They wanted me to believe no one was home, as if I were a stranger, as if I hadn't poured every ounce of my life into making sure that very house stood solid and warm. The chill of the night pressed harder against me, seeping through my coat, biting at my fingers and toes. I stood there in silence, staring at the door that had once been a symbol of family, of togetherness, and now stood as a barrier between me and everything I had ever loved. My breath came out in shaky clouds, each one reminding me how alone I was. I shifted the pies in my hands, but they no longer felt like gifts. They felt like evidence of my foolish hope, reminders of how I had believed, truly believed, that I still mattered to them. My arms ached, but I couldn't bring myself to put them down. Some part of me clung to the desperate hope that the door would still open, that my grandson would come running, that my son would smile and say, "Dad, we didn't mean it. Come inside." But the silence stretched on, cruel and endless. The only sound was the distant laughter drifting from other houses on the street, families welcoming each other, celebrating the holiday in ways I had dreamed of. Each laugh, each faint cheer, felt like another nail being driven into the coffin of my hope. Finally, I lowered my eyes and stepped back from the door. The porch that I had once helped build seemed unfamiliar, cold, hostile. I turned toward the street, my body heavy with exhaustion, my heart heavier still. With each step down the walkway, I told myself not to look back, not to give them the satisfaction of knowing how deeply they had wounded me. But I did look back. I stared at the darkened windows one last time, realizing that behind them sat people who carried my blood, my name, and yet no longer carried me in their hearts. That night, I wasn't just locked out of their home, I was locked out of their lives. The night air cut into me as I stepped off the porch, colder now than it had been just moments earlier, or maybe it only felt that way because of the emptiness pressing against my chest. The pies I carried, once a symbol of love, felt like lead in my hands, and the old suitcase at my side dragged against the ground as if it too shared my sorrow. Each step down their walkway was heavier than the last, like I was leaving behind not just a house, but every dream I had left of being part of their lives. The street was alive with warmth that wasn't mine. From other homes came the faint glow of lights, laughter spilling through the cracks of closed doors, the smell of roasted turkeys and cinnamon pies drifting through the air. I caught glimpses of silhouettes through curtained windows, families gathered around tables, children running to greet grandparents with open arms. Each passing image felt like a knife twisting in me, a cruel reminder that while others were embraced, I had been cast aside by my own flesh and blood. I tightened my coat around me, though it did little to fight the biting wind. My breath came out in shaky clouds, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence of my loneliness. I told myself to keep walking, to hold my head high, but my body betrayed me. My shoulders slumped, my pace slowed, and more than once I stopped, glancing back at their house as though the door might suddenly open, as though they might call after me and beg me to return. But the house remained dark, silent, as if it had already erased me from existence. My legs ached by the time I reached the bus stop, the cold metal bench slick with frost. I sat down heavily, setting the pies on my lap, their sweet scent now sickening. I had carried them with such pride, believing they would bring joy to the table. Instead, they mocked me now, proof of just how wrong I had been. As I waited for the bus to arrive, I stared into the darkness, my chest hollow. The world around me carried on with its celebrations, but I felt invisible, forgotten. That walk away from their door wasn't just a journey through the cold. It was the first step into a loneliness I had never known, a loneliness born not from distance, but from rejection. By the time I reached the motel, the cold had settled deep into my bones. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly, buzzing like it, too, was tired of fighting the darkness. I pushed through the glass door, dragging my suitcase behind me, the wheels squeaking against the tiled floor. The clerk barely looked up, muttering a bored greeting as he slid the key across the counter. To him, I was just another old man passing through, another weary traveler needing a place to rest. He didn't know that I carried a heartbreak heavier than any luggage. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. A single lamp lit the corner, casting a yellow glow that made the shadows seem even longer. I set the pies down on the small desk by the window and sank onto the bed. The springs creaked under my weight, as if the room itself sighed at the burden of my sorrow. For a long while, I just sat there, staring at the wall. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the heater struggling to keep the chill at bay. I thought about the dinner happening just a few streets away, the laughter, the warmth, the clinking of glasses. My family was gathered together, and I was here, alone, like I had been cast aside into the night. I tried to tell myself it was just a misunderstanding, that maybe they hadn't meant it, maybe their words weren't as cruel as they had sounded through the door, but no matter how I twisted it, the truth was undeniable. They had seen me there, they had heard my knock, and they had chosen to shut me out. My eyes burned as tears welled up, and I let them fall freely, my chest heaving with the weight of years of love turned into nothing. I thought of my wife, how she would have scolded me gently for letting myself believe things could change. She had always been the glue that held us together. Without her, I realized the bonds had crumbled faster than I wanted to admit. That night, as I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, I felt something inside me harden. I had begged for their love for too long. They had made their choice, and though I didn't know it yet, soon I would make mine. Lying there in that dim motel room, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back through the years. Fatherhood had been the very center of my life, the role I poured every ounce of myself into. From the moment I first held my son in my arms, tiny and fragile, I promised myself I would protect him, guide him, and give him a life better than the one I had. When my daughter came along, I felt the same fire in my heart. They were my purpose, my pride, and my reason to keep going even when the world seemed too heavy. I remembered the nights I stayed up late working overtime shifts, my hands blistered and my back aching, just so I could afford the things they wanted. The new shoes, the school trips, the toys they begged for. I gave them everything I could, even if it meant going without for myself. When their mother got sick, I became both parents, cooking meals, helping with homework, wiping tears, and holding them close when the weight of loss threatened to crush them. I never once thought of myself. Every decision I made, every sacrifice, was for them. And yet, as I stared at the cracks in the ceiling above me, I couldn't shake the question that gnawed at my soul. Where had all of that gone? Did they ever remember those nights I carried them to bed when they fell asleep on the couch? Did they remember how I worked 2 jobs so they could go to college, so they could stand taller in life than I ever had? Or had those memories been buried under the glitter of their new lives, their bigger houses, their selfish priorities? It hurt to think that the love I had given so freely was now treated as a burden, as something inconvenient. I had always believed that respect was the least a child could give back to a parent who sacrificed everything. But respect, it seemed, had vanished from their hearts the moment they decided I no longer fit into the picture they wanted for themselves. As the night dragged on, I realized something I had refused to see for years. Fatherhood had cost me everything, and yet, in their eyes, it meant nothing. They had turned their backs on me, and in doing so, they had freed me from the illusion that my sacrifices still mattered to them. As I lay in that motel bed, memories of the house kept pushing their way into my mind. That house was not just wood and bricks to me. It was a dream I had fought for with blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. I could still remember the day I signed the papers. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from pride. I had worked for decades in a factory, pulling double shifts, saving every penny, denying myself small comforts so one day my children could live in a place they would call home. When the realtor placed those keys in my hand, I felt like I had finally given my family something permanent, something safe, something no one could ever take away. Back then, the house needed work. The paint was peeling, the porch steps sagged, and the yard was nothing more than patches of dirt and weeds. But I didn't see flaws. I saw possibilities. I spent countless weekends repairing what was broken, painting walls, replacing boards, planting trees and flowers, so my children would grow up surrounded by beauty. I can still see them running barefoot across the yard, their laughter ringing in the air as I hammered nails into the porch. They thought I was just fixing things. What they didn't know was that every nail, every stroke of paint, was a love letter to them, proof that I was building something lasting with my own 2 hands. When my wife was alive, she filled that house with warmth. She made it more than just a structure. She made it a home. Together, we dreamed of passing it down to our children, of them raising their own families within those walls. She believed, as I did, that this house would always unite us, that no matter what happened, it would be the one place we all belonged. But lying there in that motel, I couldn't help but think how cruelly that dream had twisted. The very house I had fought to give them had become the stage for my humiliation. They sat inside those walls, enjoying the comfort I had bled for, and still decided to lock me out as though I were nothing. They had forgotten where it all came from. But I hadn't. The house wasn't just something I bought. It was something I gave pieces of myself to keep. Every paycheck I brought home seemed to vanish before it even reached my hands. There were mortgage payments, repairs, groceries, school clothes, medical bills. I never complained. I tightened my belt, worked longer hours, and told myself that as long as my children had what they needed, I could live without what I wanted. While other men my age spent their money on hobbies or small luxuries, I spent mine on textbooks, field trips, and new shoes. My joy came from seeing them happy, from knowing they could walk into their classrooms and hold their heads high because they didn't lack for anything. There were winters when the furnace broke, and I stayed up all night patching it together just so they wouldn't wake up cold. There were summers when the roof leaked, and I climbed up there alone, hammer in hand, sweat pouring down my face, praying it would hold long enough until I could afford proper repairs. I remember times when I'd come home from the factory so exhausted my body ached, but still I'd find myself fixing a broken chair, replacing a faucet, or painting a wall, just to make sure the house never stopped feeling like a sanctuary. Even the little things I gave up added up to a mountain of sacrifices. I rarely bought new clothes for myself, patching old shirts and polishing the same shoes until the soles wore thin. Vacations were something I only heard about from coworkers. I never traveled, never indulged, because every extra dollar was set aside for my children, and when my wife passed, It only made me work harder. I couldn't let them see me falter. I wanted them to believe they were still secure, still cared for, even though I was falling apart inside. I often told myself that one day they would see all of this, that one day, when they were grown and had families of their own, they would look back and realize how much was given up for them. I imagined gratitude in their eyes, a soft word of thanks, a recognition of the years I had carried them on my back. But sitting alone in that motel, replaying the sound of their whispers through the locked door, I understood the harsh truth. They hadn't seen, they hadn't cared, and maybe they never would. For years, my children had assumed the house was theirs. After all, they lived in it, raised their children in it, and filled its rooms with their belongings. To them, it was natural to believe that ownership had quietly shifted somewhere along the way. But the truth is, the deed never left my hands. Legally, that house was always mine. I had thought about transferring it many times, even spoke with my lawyer once or twice about making it official, but something always held me back. At first, it was practicality. I told myself that keeping it in my name would protect them, that if anything went wrong, I could step in to handle it. But as the years passed, another reason kept me from signing those papers: doubt. It wasn't a doubt born out of mistrust at the beginning, but a quiet hesitation. A part of me wanted to hold on to the last thing I had built with my wife, to keep it close to my chest as though letting go of it meant letting go of her. That house had her fingerprints in every corner, her favorite curtains in the kitchen, her flowers in the yard, her laughter echoing in the walls. I wasn't ready to hand it over entirely because in my heart, it still belonged to both of us. But as time went on and I saw the way my children treated me, that hesitation turned into something else. Their dismissive words, their lack of visits, their coldness, it all planted a seed of caution in me. What if I gave them everything, only to find myself discarded? What if once the papers were signed, I no longer mattered at all? I held on to the deed like a shield, telling myself it was temporary, but secretly knowing it was also a safeguard for my dignity. When they locked me out on Thanksgiving night, I realized the weight of that decision. By never transferring the deed, I had unknowingly preserved the only power I had left. They thought they could shut me out and erase me from their lives. But the truth was, the very roof over their heads still carried my name. That single piece of paper, forgotten in a drawer for years, had become my last defense against their cruelty, and in time, it would become the very weapon of my revenge. The days after Thanksgiving dragged by in a blur. I went through the motions of life, waking up, eating a little, sitting in my chair, but nothing felt the same. The sound of their voices behind that door, the way they laughed at me, echoed in my head like a cruel song I couldn't escape. I kept replaying it, hoping the memory would change, that maybe I'd hear different words if I listened closely enough. But no. Each time, the whispers cut just as deep, reminding me that to them, I was no longer a father, no longer family. I was just an inconvenience, an unwanted guest. For years I had convinced myself to be patient, to forgive the little slights, to believe that love would eventually bring them back to me. But that night on the porch had torn away the last illusion. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had rejected me. They had humiliated me in the cruelest way possible, turning me into a stranger at the very door I once opened for them 1,000 times. And something inside me shifted. The man who had once accepted scraps of affection, who had swallowed every insult, who had waited quietly for his children to remember him, he was gone. I sat in my small living room one evening, staring at the old deed that had sat untouched for years. My name was there in bold letters, proof that the home they took for granted was still mine. For the first time, I didn't see it as just a piece of paper. I saw it as justice. They had slammed the door in my face, but here, in my hands, I held the power to open another kind of door, a door to consequences they never saw coming. It wasn't an easy thought. These were my children, my flesh and blood. I had loved them more than life itself, but love cannot survive without respect, and they had buried respect long ago. That night on the porch was not the first betrayal, it was simply the last straw. Tears burned my eyes as I folded the paper and slid it back into its envelope. My hands trembled, but not from weakness, from resolve. They thought they had cast me aside forever, but I was done waiting for love that would never return. The time had come to show them what it meant to shut a door on their own father. The next morning, I folded the deed carefully and tucked it into my old leather satchel. My legs felt heavy as I walked to the bus stop, but my resolve carried me forward. I wasn't headed to see my children this time. I was headed to the one man who could help me turn this paper into action, my lawyer. The ride into town felt endless, the rumble of the bus mixing with the storm of thoughts in my head. I kept asking myself if I was really about to do this. Was I truly going to hand my own children eviction papers? The thought twisted in my chest, but then I remembered the sound of their laughter behind that door, the way they left me in the cold, and the hesitation inside me hardened into certainty. The law office smelled of old books and polished wood. My lawyer, a man who had known me for years, greeted me with a warm handshake. He had seen me at my lowest before, when my wife passed, when I struggled to hold the family together. And he looked at me now with quiet concern. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his tone careful. I laid the deed on his desk and slid it toward him. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded in my chest. "I want to file eviction papers," I said, "for my children." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long moment. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "This isn't something you can take back once it's done." I nodded. "I'm sure. They shut me out, literally. They forgot who gave them everything they have, and I can't keep living like this, waiting for respect that never comes. If they won't honor me as their father, then they can learn to respect me as the man who owns the roof over their heads." The lawyer nodded slowly, then began to prepare the documents. As his pen scratched across the paper, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief because this was not the future I had once dreamed of. Relief because at last I was no longer powerless. By the time I signed my name, I knew there was no turning back. The door they closed on me would soon close on them as well. 2 weeks slipped by, each day heavy with silence. I went about my routine quietly, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. Every morning, I'd wake with a knot in my stomach, torn between sorrow and anticipation. Part of me still ached for the love I had once felt in that house, but another part knew this was justice long overdue. They had chosen to treat me like a burden, to laugh while I stood outside in the cold, and soon they would see the cost of their cruelty. On a frosty December morning, the day arrived. I wasn't there when the knock sounded at their door, but I could picture it in my mind as clearly as if I stood on the porch myself. The same knock they had ignored from me on Thanksgiving now carried a different weight. This time it came from my lawyer, dressed in his usual dark suit, a stack of neatly prepared papers in his hand. Inside, I imagined the children glancing at one another, confused by the unfamiliar figure at their doorstep. They had no reason to expect him, no reason to suspect that their comfortable life was about to unravel. My son would have opened the door cautiously, his wife standing just behind him, perhaps still carrying that air of superiority she always wore around me. Then the words would have fallen, calm and professional. "I'm here on behalf of your father. You've been served." He would have handed over the envelope, and in that instant, the smug security they had wrapped themselves in would begin to crumble. I was told later that my daughter-in-law was the first to speak, her voice sharp with indignation. "This must be a mistake. This house is ours." But the lawyer, steady as always, explained that no mistake had been made. The deed was still in my name. The papers were legal and binding. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. I could imagine their faces, the color draining, the forced laughter dying in their throats as the truth sank in. The home they had claimed as theirs was never truly theirs at all. They had locked me out, forgetting who had built their foundation, and now the ground beneath them was slipping away. That knock on their door carried with it the weight of every sacrifice, every humiliation, every betrayal. And this time, it wasn't me left standing outside. It was them. The news hit them like a storm they never saw coming. At first there was denial. My son stared at the papers as though he could will the words to change, his lips moving but no sound escaping. My daughter-in-law snatched the envelope from his hands, flipping through the pages with growing panic, her eyes darting from line to line as though searching for some loophole, some error that would make it all disappear. But there was none. The truth was printed clearly in black and white, and it carried the weight of law. Denial quickly gave way to outrage. "How could he do this to us?" my daughter-in-law hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "After everything we've done for him." As if neglect, mockery, and abandonment counted as generosity. My son tried to argue too, his words stumbling over themselves. "Dad he wouldn't really put us out. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding." But even as he said it, I think he knew the truth. For the first time in years, he was forced to remember who I was, not the weak old man they thought they could ignore, but the father who had built their lives from nothing. When outrage failed, desperation took its place. I heard later how my son's voice cracked when he asked the lawyer to give them more time, how my daughter-in-law tried to soften her tone, pleading that surely there was another solution. They begged for mercy, for compromise, for anything that would allow them to stay in the home they had once barred me from. But the lawyer only shook his head. "Your father has made his decision. You have 30 days. I could almost see it, the way their pride collapsed under the weight of reality. The woman who once laughed at my gifts was now clutching the very walls around her as though holding on could change the truth. The son who once called me a burden was now scrambling to keep the roof I had given him. Every word they spoke, every desperate plea, only reminded me how easily they had cast me aside. They hadn't thought of me as family then, and now they were reaping the cost of that choice. What they didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Their begging was nothing compared to the reckoning still to come, when I would stand before them myself, not as the forgotten father, but as the man they could no longer ignore. When the time came to face them, I walked up the same path I had once taken with such hope on Thanksgiving night, but this time I carried no pies, no gifts, no illusions, only truth. My heart was steady, my steps deliberate. I knew what I was about to say, and there would be no turning back. They opened the door quickly when they saw me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear and guilt. My son looked like a child again, caught doing something shameful, while my daughter-in-law's arrogance had melted into panic. She tried to speak first, her words tumbling over one another. "We didn't mean it. It was just a mistake. We thought—" But I raised my hand, silencing her. I looked at my son, the boy I had carried, Ed on my shoulders, the man I had sacrificed everything for, and I saw in his eyes the reflection of every ungrateful word he had ever spoken. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years. "You shut the door on me. You left me in the cold. You made me feel like I was nothing, but I am the reason this house stands. I am the reason you've had a roof over your head, food on your table, and warmth in your lives. And when I came to share one simple meal, you decided I wasn't worth the seat." My son's lips trembled, but no words came out. He lowered his head, and for once he had no excuses to give. I turned to his wife, who had mocked me most cruelly. "You laughed at me when you thought I couldn't hear. You called my gifts cheap, my presence a burden. But tell me, what is cheap now? The man you dismissed owns the very walls you cling to." Her face drained of color, and she looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I let the silence stretch before I spoke again, softer but sharper. "You forgot who I was. You forgot the father who worked himself to the bone so you could have a better life, and you thought you could lock me out forever. But now you will learn that doors swing both ways. You closed yours on me. Now I am closing mine on you." The words hung in the air like a judgment neither of them could escape. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one begging. They were. And I was done listening. The day of their departure arrived like the slow turning of a final page. The house that had once been filled with their laughter, their belongings, their careless certainty, now stood in quiet disarray. Boxes lined the hallways, bags were piled by the door, and for the first time in years, my children moved through those rooms with their heads lowered, stripped of the pride that had once made them so blind. I watched from the porch as movers carried out furniture, the same pieces I had helped them buy, the same couches where my grandchildren had once curled up with bedtime stories. Each piece taken out felt like the unraveling of a life they had thought untouchable. My son barely looked at me as he passed by with a box in his arms. His shoulders slumped, his face pale, his mouth pressed shut against the words I knew he wanted to say but couldn't. My daughter-in-law, once so quick to sneer, now kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her jaw tight, her hands trembling as she guided the children out to the car. Her silence was louder than any insult she had ever thrown at me. Even the children, too young to understand, seemed to sense the weight of the moment. They clutched their toys close, glancing nervously at the adults, unsure why the home they had always known was slipping away. I didn't speak as they loaded the car, nor did I stop them when they made their final trip inside. There were no shouting matches, no last attempts at excuses, only the sound of boxes shifting and doors closing, one after another. When at last the car was packed and ready, my son finally looked at me. For a long moment his eyes searched mine, as though begging for forgiveness, for a lifeline I was no longer willing to throw. I gave. Him. Nothing. Not cruelty. Not comfort. Just silence. The engine started, the tires crunched against the gravel, and slowly, the car pulled away. I stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing I had built decades ago, watching until the taillights disappeared down the road. My heart ached, yes, but there was peace beneath the ache. They had chosen to lock me out. Now they were the ones leaving, carrying with them the weight of a lesson they would never forget. The house stood behind me, quiet, mine again, not just in name but in truth. When the house was finally quiet again, I walked through each room slowly, my footsteps echoing against the bare floors. The walls still carried the faint marks of their lives, scratches where furniture had been dragged, faded spots where pictures once hung. But now it was just me and the silence. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like peace. I touched the doorframe where I had once measured their heights as children, my finger brushing over the faint pencil lines. I thought of the little hands that once clung to mine, the voices that once called me Daddy with so much love. Somewhere along the way, that love had turned cold, but the memories reminded me that I had given them everything I could, and no one could take that away from me. I sat in the kitchen, the same place where my wife and I once shared coffee in the mornings, and I thought about the journey that had led me here. I had sacrificed my youth, my health, my happiness, to build a life for them. And in return, they gave me a locked door on Thanksgiving night. That moment had hurt more than anything I'd ever endured, but it had also opened my eyes. Family is not just blood, it is respect, kindness, and gratitude. Without those, all you have are people who share your name, but not your heart. As painful as it was, evicting them was not about revenge alone. It was about dignity. It was about reminding them, and reminding myself, that I was not worthless, not invisible. I had value, and I deserved respect. Sometimes, the only way to teach those who have forgotten is to let them feel the weight of their actions. They shut me out, and now they knew what it felt like to lose the home that stood because of me. Looking around that house, I realized it wasn't just a structure of wood and brick. It was a symbol of everything I had endured and everything I had built. And now, it stood as a reminder that even the most patient heart has limits. If you've listened to my story this far, I want to thank you. And I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments if you've ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes, the deepest wounds lead to the most powerful lessons.